Hello, I'm Justin Burke, Director of the Institute for Advanced Dialectical Research, and on behalf of the Institute, I'm proud to announce that the Dialectic Medal has been awarded to Pope Francis. In fact, here I am presenting the medal to the Pope at the Vatican earlier this month. And accompanying that medal was a citation, which read, "For his uncompromising humanitarianism, sense of social justice, and commitment to dialectical thinking with which he tirelessly advocates for world peace, human equality, and the protection of the environment, the Dialectic Medal is awarded to Pope Francis." Pope Francis, head of the Catholic Church, one of the best-known religious leaders in the world. You're probably familiar with Francis the humanitarian. You know him as an advocate for peace and for the poor. But Francis the dialectical thinker, that may be a side of him you don't know. So in this presentation, I want to talk a little about the dialectics of Pope Francis. Now, the Pope is not what we would normally categorize as a systematic thinker, nor would he claim to be. He is famously the first Jesuit Pope, being a member of the Society of Jesus, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. But apart from the Jesuits, he is not associated with any particular formal school of theology, which is related to the fact that he's the first pope in over a century to come to the papacy without a doctorate in theology or canon law or some other church-related field. Instead, as theology professor Peter Casarella puts it, Francis schooled himself deeply in selected academic concerns and in the theological work of disparate ecclesial sources, not the least of which was his profound immersion in Ignatian spirituality. Which brings us back to the Jesuits. Francis was significantly influenced in that Ignatian spirituality by the Jesuit philosopher, or I guess we could call him the Hegelian Jesuit, Gaston Fassard, who wrote the Dialectic of the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, a book with a long title which provided what Francis describes as the root of his dialectical thinking. The spiritual exercises are something that all Jesuits go through as part of their religious formation. In fact, they do it multiple times, at least twice during their training. And Francis says that he was particularly influenced by this particularly dialectical interpretation of the exercises as presented by Fassard, which was not really well known until Francis told his biographer Massimo Borghese about it during his research for the recent book, The Mind of Pope Francis. We also have a statement that the Pope made just a few months ago when he was addressing a group in Assisi, and he was talking about how he's influenced by ideas and how there's this one idea that has fascinated him ever since he was a young theology student. And that idea, he says, is, in Latin, coincidentia oppositorum. That is, the unity of opposites, as he translates it. He does not, however, cite a source for this phrase, but in theology, it dates back to the 15th century German cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, maybe even earlier. And in philosophy, we're familiar with this idea more recently from Hegel, who talks about the grasping of opposites in their unity, or of the positive in the negative. Now, speaking of Hegel, which admittedly Francis doesn't do very much himself, but he did actually write the foreword to a book about Hegel, and this was the Argentine philosopher Emilio Podetti's book about Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. There's the bicentennial edition. Hegel originally published his Phenomenology in 1807, and this is the 2007 publication of Podetti's commentary with a foreword by then Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Bergoglio, who is not even listed on the cover, as you can see. But here he is in the table of contents, foreword by Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Society of Jesus. And Francis credits Podetti with introducing him to the dialectical concept of the periphery. In fact, Francis has even been called the Pope of the peripheries, and not just because the College of Cardinals went to the ends of the earth to elect a Pope from South America, as he joked during his first appearance on the balcony at St. Peter's, but also because, as he explains, reality is better understood from the peripheries than from the center. And according to Hegel, the center has no significance without the periphery, nor the periphery without the center. Each aspect is necessary, Hegel says, but each one is one-sided when taken alone. That's their dialectical significance. Each one is defined in terms of the other, or conversely has no meaning without the other, even though we may try to separate them or focus on one side rather than the other. Francis says that from the edge, that is, from the periphery, from the edge comes the hope of restoring the dignity of the people. By opening up to the margins, we unleash change. To embrace the margins is to expand our horizons, for we see more clearly and more broadly from the edges of society. There's a devotional image that Francis likes to call attention to. It's a popular subject. There are many versions of it. Here's one, and you see it shows Jesus knocking on a door. And it's meant to illustrate a line from the Bible in the book of Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Francis loves this image. He says that it shows Jesus knocking on the door, trying to come into our hearts. But then he inverts the image and invites us to imagine not Jesus knocking to come in, as we see here, but knocking from the inside to be let out of the institutional center of the church, to go out to the margins of society, to the periphery, where he says people grapple with sin, with pain, with injustice. And this reminds me of how Francis describes the Jesuits themselves. They are paradoxically a society united in their dispersion. To introduce another Latin phrase, he calls them a communitas ad dispersionum, a community to be dispersed. That is, united in being scattered, in going from the center out into the world. That's the mission of the Jesuits. What holds them together is their being split up and sent abroad, a paradoxical idea that obviously appeals to Francis. Now I want to go back to that other Latin phrase, coincidentia oppositorum, the unity of opposites, that Francis said captivated him as a young theology student, because opposition is a major theme in Francis's dialectics. Antonio Spadaro was the longtime editor of a Jesuit journal in Rome, but just last month he started a new job at the Vatican as Undersecretary of the Dicastery for Culture and Education. So Father Spadaro has known the Pope for many years. He's traveled with Francis, and they've done a few books together, and Spadaro has just one word to describe the Pope, and that word is volcanic. He says, the Pope is volcanic. He likes to enter into dialogue, to open doors. There's that image of the door again. He likes to open doors and windows, to do an abrupt turn, but above all, to enter into a dialectic. He doesn't engage in dialogue without referring to some sort of concrete experience. His type of reasoning isn't based on abstract concepts. Instead, it is a reflection and an exchange about real life. That's how Spadaro describes a dialogue with the Pope. And in one of those dialogues, Spadaro says the Pope told him, opposition opens up a path, a road to travel down. Speaking more generally, I must say that I love oppositions. Oppositions help. Human life is structured in oppositional form. Now, I mentioned that Francis was the first Pope in a long time not to have completed a doctorate, but that doesn't mean he didn't begin one. In fact, he did begin doctoral research, and it was on a man named Romano Guardini, who obviously couldn't possibly sound any more Italian, but he was actually a German theologian. And the subject of the Pope's doctoral research was Guardini's book, Der Gegensatz, which you perhaps won't be surprised to learn means opposition. In fact, Francis calls Guardini the master of oppositions, because it was Guardini, he says, who gave him what he calls the startling insight that oppositions could coexist within a larger unity. Francis became so committed to this idea, in fact, that he went to Germany to research Guardini's Gegensatz, but unfortunately he never completed his dissertation. Many years later, he says in the recent book Let Us Dream that in 2012, after I turned 75, when I thought Pope Benedict might accept my resignation as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, it occurred to me, for a time, that I might after all finish the thesis on Guardini's opposition. But in March 2013, I was instead transferred to another diocese, which of course is the Pope's very understated way of explaining that he did not, in fact, retire when he turned 75 in 2012, but following the surprise resignation of Pope Benedict, Francis was elected Pope himself. So instead of going back to researching opposition in his retirement, he had to relocate from Buenos Aires to his new diocese, as he put it, in Rome. So he went from the unity of opposites as a young theology student to the opposition of Romano Guardini as a mature research student, and then finally to Pope. And a few years into his papacy, he met the French author Dominique Walton, who, like Father Spadaro, compiled a book of dialogues called A Future of Faith. In fact, it's in this book that Francis calls Guardini the master of oppositions. And in the book, Walton asks the Pope what he finds most difficult. And Francis answers him in an inverted way, telling him that he finds interreligious dialogue easier than ecumenism, meaning that he finds dialogue between different religions, such as Christianity and Islam, easier than dialogue within a single religion, i.e., between Catholic and Protestant Christians. Catholics and Protestants are obviously going to agree on more than Christians and Muslims, but when oppositions arise between religions, Francis suggests it leads one to focus more on the shared humanity of the opposing groups. Our greatest and yet our most fragile treasure, he says, is our shared humanity. Walton, though, the author, seems confused, or maybe he's just a little surprised, because he asks, it's the differences that bring you closer together? And Francis says simply, why yes, it's dialectics. To which Walton replies, that's strange. When you're farther apart, when there's more opposition, it's easier to come together. Now, I don't know if this scene is the best example of dialectics in action, even though Francis actually does use the word dialectics, but I think it's interesting to see that this is how he frames his way of thinking in this situation, presenting it as an example of dialectics, of a coincidentia oppositorum, or unity of opposites. Or maybe a better way of looking at it would be to see that what is common, which is our shared humanity, is not, in fact, opposed, and for that reason does not need to be brought back together in some kind of external or artificial synthesis. That what is in actuality opposed is not our humanity, but merely the external cultural forms that humanity takes on in the trappings of outwardly opposed religions. That's what I take from this anyway, that the spiritual aspect of humanity fractures or breaks apart into the various world religions, while that original shared humanity, remember what Francis called our greatest yet most fragile treasure, that humanity is the link that binds the world's religious traditions together in their mutual tensions and contradictions, oppositions, etc. And discussing this inner link is what Francis describes as dialectics, seeking and finding this immanent humanity in the world's religious traditions is, I would argue, at least some aspect of Francis's dialectical thinking. Now there's another scene in this book that I want to mention, and it's the moment when Walton asks the Pope, "Where is God in Auschwitz?" And Francis says, "I don't know where God is, but I do know where man is. Man manufactures arms and sells them. It's us in our corrupt humanity. But people think it's easy to ask that question. Why does God allow that? But we are the ones who are doing that. And why do we allow ourselves to do that? The arms trafficker selling weapons to one side, fighting another, and then selling to the other side as well. Such corruption," Francis says. Now maybe there's a dialectic of God and man in there, but what I think is most dialectical in this exchange is negation. That is, Francis pointing out man's negation of his own humanity. Again, our greatest, most fragile treasure. And in dialectical terms, there's no sublation of that. There's no canceling and preserving of that negation, which instead needs to be negated again. Francis is really calling for a negation of the negation. It's a double negation in which man first negates his own humanity with all this inhuman corruption, and Francis's point seems to be that God isn't responsible for this, and further that God can't help us out of this situation, which we must negate again ourselves in order to reclaim our humanity. So to me, that element of negation and negation of the negation brings Francis's discourse totally within the realm of dialectics, and leads to the final example I want to take from Walton's book. And that's a dialogue in which Francis contrasts the simple message and the pastoral approach of Jesus with that of religious fundamentalism. And it's fundamentalism, Francis says, that says you can go so far, but no farther. You can do this, but you can't do that. That's how religious fundamentalism works, Francis says. But he says there is another logic. He says Jesus Christ did not respect the habits that had become commandments. This is his explanation of religious fundamentalism. Jesus didn't respect habits that had become commandments, just habits is all they are, because he touched lepers, which you weren't supposed to do. He refused to stone the adulteress when that's what other people did. He talked to the Samaritan woman when people were not supposed to. Did Jesus Christ not respect the law, Francis asks? Or was the law of the others wrong? It was degenerate, yes, as a result of fundamentalism, Francis says. And Jesus Christ, he goes on, responded by going in the other direction. I think that applies to all aspects of culture, Francis says. When I destroy harmony intentionally, when I take one element and render it absolute, I destroy harmony. That's what fundamentalists do. An extraordinary dialogue. Or in this case, really a monologue, I guess, since Francis was doing all the talking. And what he was doing was showing the danger of one-sided thinking, of religious fundamentalism in this case. How it leads to a total collapse, to a negation, you could say. And what does Jesus do? He negates that negation. He performs what in the literature of dialectics is known as determinate negation. What Jesus does is to employ what Marcuse calls the power of negative thinking. You're supposed to stone the adulterers, shun the lepers, avoid the Samaritans, but amazingly, Francis says, Jesus instead employs another logic. I'm not saying that. Francis is the one saying that. And the Marcuse I mentioned is Herbert Marcuse, one of the major dialectical thinkers of the 20th century, who said that the given reality has its own logic and its own truth. The effort to comprehend them as such and to transcend them, to go beyond the given reality, presupposes a different logic, a contradicting truth. This is dialectics, the logic of negation, and not just any negation, but determinate negation, which Marcuse says denotes the governing principle of dialectical thought. And negation is determinate, he says, if it refers the established state of affairs, the given reality, to the basic factors and forces that make for its destructiveness, as well as for the possible alternatives beyond the status quo. Francis said that Jesus responded to the status quo of shunning lepers, stoning adulterers, and so on. Jesus' response was to employ another logic, another way of thinking, and to go in the opposite direction. To which I would add Marcuse's point that the ability of thought to develop a logic and language of contradiction, that is a dialectical way of thinking, this is a prerequisite for this task of going in the opposite direction, of negating the present state of affairs. Reality as it is, Marcuse says, is overcome by being comprehended as the mere possibility of another reality. This reality, the status quo, the bad situation Jesus finds himself in, is overcome by being seen as the possibility of another reality. This bad state of affairs, if we look at it dialectically, is the possibility of a better state of affairs. And back to Marcuse, he says that that possibility is overcome by being realized. Who wants possibility, right? Anything is possible, but what we want is reality. which is why Marcuse says possibility is overcome by being realized. This is the dialectics of liberation, which Marcuse says he actually finds to be a redundant phrase, because he says, I believe that all dialectic is liberation. And not only liberation in an intellectual sense, but liberation involving the mind and the body, liberation involving all of human existence. Now, I'm not suggesting that Pope Francis is a secret Marcusean, but I am saying that I think he would definitely agree with Marcuse on at least some of these points of dialectic. For example, in one of his major texts, Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, Francis says, any person who has experienced a profound liberation becomes more sensitive to the needs of others. Which reminds me of something that Marcuse said. Not in a book or in a lecture. It was actually shortly before he died, when he was visited in the hospital by the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who incidentally was the first recipient of the Dialectic Medal. And Habermas says that he and Marcuse were discussing the normative base of critical theory, the philosophical critique of society that they were engaged in. And Marcuse said that what it comes down to is that our most basic value judgments are rooted in compassion, in our sense for the suffering of others. Now think of Francis's first act as Pope. Cardinal Bergoglio has just been elected Pope from the ends of the earth, and what's the first thing he does? He has to take a name. And he doesn't do what most popes do, which is to take the name of some other pope. Instead, he takes the name of a saint, St. Francis of Assisi, which came as quite a surprise, like a lot of things that Francis does. So he was later asked why he took the name of St. Francis. And he said, for me, Francis is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. Wherever he went, he sowed seeds of peace and walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, and the outcast. So what is Pope Francis saying about St. Francis? He's saying St. Francis went out from the center, from the church, to those who were outcast, on the peripheries, who were suffering. That was Francis's first act as Pope. Now think of his first trip as Pope. The first place that he traveled to was a small island off the coast of Africa, Lampedusa, which, even though it's so far away, is actually part of Italy. Its southernmost point. Again, out on the periphery, the farthest point from the center. And Francis went there to bring attention to the thousands of refugees who had died in the seas around Lampedusa attempting to reach Europe. Has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters? Francis asked. Has any one of us wept for the young mothers carrying their babies, for these men who were looking for a means of supporting their families? The culture of comfort, which makes us think only of ourselves, makes us insensitive to the cries of other people. Indeed, it even leads to the globalization of indifference. We have become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. It's none of my business. We are a society that has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion. And Francis defines it for us in case we didn't know or in case we forgot. Compassion, he says, literally means suffering with others. It is an act of charity, Francis says, to assist someone who is suffering. But it is also an act of charity to work to change the social conditions that have caused his or her suffering. And how do we do that? We need dialectics, the power of negative thinking, the ability of thought to develop a logic and language of contradiction. That's how Marcuse put it. That's what dialectical thinking allows us, what it enables us to do. The need to resolve the structural causes of poverty cannot be delayed, Francis says. Society needs to be cured of a sickness that is weakening and frustrating it, and that can only lead to new crises. Just as goodness tends to spread, the toleration of evil, which is injustice, tends to expand its baneful influence and quietly to undermine any political and social system, no matter how solid it may appear. If every action has its consequences, and evil embedded in the structures of a society has a constant potential for disintegration and death. Now notice that Francis is not saying that society is going to be attacked and overrun from outside. Instead, he suggests that society contains what Hegel called the original disease and inborn germ of death. That is, that it is subject to imminent collapse due to its own inherent contradictions. It's a whole that hasn't accounted for all of its parts. It's the global that is not concerned with the local. It acknowledges the center, but not the periphery. Francis is doing a legitimate dialectical critique here, which begins with him saying that it is evil crystallized in unjust social structures that cannot be the basis of hope for a better future. Dialectical thinking begins by recognizing the evil, the injustice that Francis has identified in the structures of society. That it's not just an issue of the greed of a few, as unjust and immoral as that may be, but much more catastrophically that it has the potential to bring down not just our entire social system, but our natural environment with it. The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits, Francis says. In this system, which tends to devour everything that stands in the way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which become the only rule. Remember why Pope Francis said he took the name of St. Francis. For me, he said, Francis is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. St. Francis heard the voice of the poor, he heard the voice of the infirm, and he heard the voice of nature, Francis says. He made of them a way of life. St. Francis, he says, provides the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and, Francis says, of an integral ecology. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. Pope Francis says that St. Francis helps us to see that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories that transcend the language of mathematics and biology and take us to the heart of what it is to be human. And what is it to be human? Well, whether we acknowledge it or not, it means not that we're merely related to nature, but are a part of nature. The usual thinking is that humanity has some relation to nature, and that relation is more often than not one of domination and exploitation, which Francis describes as a Promethean vision of mastery over the world. Just as there's a tension between parts and whole, center and periphery, global and local, Francis acknowledges a tension between humanity and nature, where we see ourselves as both separate from nature and at the same time dominant over it. Yet, we've heard Francis use this intriguing phrase, integral ecology. Integral, meaning integrated, inseparable. In fact, Francis says nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature. And that right there demonstrates a dialectical awareness. Not a call for humanity to come together with nature, but an acknowledgement that humanity is inseparable from nature, that it's purely one-sided thinking to see nature on one side and ourselves on another and in need of somehow coming back together. We're already there. It's just that many of us aren't aware of it, aren't thinking dialectically about this relation. Francis reminds us that we do not look at the world from without, but from within. We're already within the periphery. We're already a unity with nature, but human thought insists on drawing a false, one-sided distinction, thinking it's somehow on the outside looking in. Now, I've switched here from quoting from Francis's Evangelii Gaudium to his encyclical, Laudato Si, which takes its name from a quotation from St. Francis's Canticle to the Canticle of the Sun. Laudato Si means praise be to you. But I think of this text as Francis's Dialectics of Nature, which is the title of a book by Friedrich Engels, whom I don't think Francis particularly wants to be associated with. Though I did read in an article, an interview in which he was asked how he felt about being called a Marxist or a communist early in his papacy, and he had what I thought was an interesting response. Francis said, "I have met many Marxists in my life who are good people, so I am not offended by these comments." So if we look at Laudato Si, and there are many other dialectical aspects of Francis' thinking that I could go on and on talking about, but I'm going to end with some thoughts on the dialectics of this major text, which brings together so many important lines of his thought, beginning with its overall theme, which is ostensibly nature and the environment. Its subtitle, in fact, is On Care for Our Common Home. But as Francis pointed out in a dialogue with Father Spadaro, Laudato Si is not a green encyclical, he says. It is a social encyclical. It begins with the reality of this moment, which is ecological. And there's that word again, ecology, which is significant because literally it means the study of our home, in Greek, oikos, as reflected in Francis's subtitle. While in practice, it refers to the study of the relations of organisms to one another and to their environment. And defined in that way, I think it would be difficult to argue that somehow humans are not included in that. When we speak of the environment, Francis says, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and the society that lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, he says, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. He goes on, it is essential to seek comprehensive solutions that consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and with social systems. Thus, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis that is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution, he says, demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. To do this, Francis says, we urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together the different fields of knowledge, including economics, which of course has the same root as ecology, oikos. Bringing these together, Francis says, in the service of a more integral and integrating vision. And there's the word integral again. Today, the analysis of environmental problems cannot be separated, he says, from the analysis of human, family, work-related, and urban contexts, nor from how individuals relate to themselves, which in turn leads to how they relate to others and to the environment. There is an interrelation between ecosystems and between the various spheres of social interaction. That is, between whole and parts, which cannot be separated. The whole is made up of parts, the parts make up the whole. And other than that, I don't think I really need to add any commentary to what Francis is saying. In fact, I probably could have spent this whole time just reading from Laudato Si, which may be the best, the most sustained, comprehensive, and consistent example of Francis's dialectical thinking, mainly because of the scope and scale of the subject matter, which is totality. Hegel famously said that the truth is the whole, and Francis's subject in Laudato Si is the entire ecosystem, taken as a whole, nature and humanity considered together. He says, there can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology. That is the joint study of our home and the study of ourselves. As for actually putting theory into practice, Francis says, a great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us. A strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety, for it is not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic that underlies present-day culture. Now, we've seen Francis mention logic before, and not in the sense of the formal logic of logicians, but as an overall way of thinking, because that's what Francis, like other dialectical thinkers, is calling into question. Not the facts, not circumstances, not even how these are interpreted, but our entire way of thinking about them, which, according to ordinary, conventional logic, doesn't need to go beyond one-sided thinking. In fact, is unable to go beyond one-sided thinking, since it reduces everything to a single view. Either nature or humanity, either center or periphery, global or local. But Francis says we need to look at reality in a different way. That is, we must become aware of its processes and relations in order to discern what he describes as the message contained in the structures of nature itself. It cannot be emphasized enough, he says, how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation, he says. And I love the subtle reference there to the quantum realm, where the structures of nature conform to completely different laws of physics. The same way dialectical thinking does not conform to the ordinary laws of thought. Unfortunately, however, he says, our immense technological development has not been accompanied by an equivalent development in human responsibility. Each age, Francis says, tends to have only a meager awareness of its own limitations. Humanity has taken up technology and its development according to an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm, he says, sounding again like Herbert Marcuse there. Marcuse's most famous book being One-Dimensional Man, which, as Francis is discussing, is about the global consequences of one-dimensional or one-sided thinking. The specialization that belongs to technology, Francis says, makes it difficult to see the larger picture. The fragmentation of knowledge proves helpful for concrete applications, and yet often leads to a loss of appreciation for the whole, for the relationships between things, and for the broader horizon, which then becomes irrelevant. This very fact, this one-sided non-dialectical thinking, I would add, this fact makes it hard to find adequate ways of solving the more complex problems of today's world, particularly those regarding the environment and the poor. These problems cannot be dealt with from a single perspective or from a single set of interests, he says. And to continue this critique of one-sided thinking, Francis goes on. He says, ecological culture cannot be reduced to a series of urgent and partial, that is, one-sided, responses to the immediate problems of pollution, environmental decay, and the depletion of natural resources. There needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, a dialectical way, I would add, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality that together generate resistance to the assault of the technological paradigm. Excuse me, the technocratic paradigm is what Francis calls it. Otherwise, he goes on, even the best ecological initiatives can find themselves caught up in the same globalized logic. Again, logic, the ordinary, undialectical way of thinking. To seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem that comes up, he says, is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. The true is the whole, we've seen Hegel say, and here we're seeing Francis again talking about totality. He says we must strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. A new way of thinking. And what I've tried to show is how, for Francis, that thinking is dialectical. Beginning early on with that fascinating idea, as he described it, of the unity of opposites, then through his Jesuit formation under the influence of Gaston Fessard's Dialectic of the Spiritual Exercises, and later through his research into Romano Guardini's opposition, and finally the impact of another figure from the peripheries like himself, Amelia Podetti, with her particularly South American interpretation of Hegel. I've suggested that when we start to consider Pope Francis's thinking in terms of this deeply ingrained dialectical framework, we begin to see dialectics emerging throughout his writing, his speeches, his homilies, even his impromptu remarks. And always in the service of that tireless humanitarianism I mentioned at the start. We find Francis actually seeking out opposition, difference, polarity, tension, negation, not to eradicate or cancel them out, but in true dialectical fashion to maintain and preserve them on what he describes as a higher plane. And I want to end with a line that appears in Fratelli Tutti, Francis's most recent encyclical. And in it he says, differences are creative. They create tension. And in the resolution of tension lies humanity's progress.